We also have reports that a senior law enforcement official, speaking on condition of anonymity, said that there has been some intelligence that raised concerns about a previously scheduled flight of Columbia, which was to have carried the same crew. The intelligence which was related to the Israeli astronaut Ilan Ramon was termed not credible, but the flight was postponed for other reasons. There's been no troubling intelligence regarding this flight, officials said, and they do not believe that terrorism was involved. We stress that again. We've talked to several experts about it this morning. Officials are telling us that there's no indication of terrorism here. The Space Shuttle Columbia was well over the 200,000-foot mark, more than 40 miles up, and what seems to have happened here, and the only thing likely to have happened here, according to any of the astronauts and other engineers and experts that we've talked to this morning, seems to be some kind of catastrophic breakup, some trouble on re-entry. The first time in the 42-year history of manned space flight in the U.S. program that there's been any kind of problem on re-entry. The 1986 Challenger explosion was on takeoff. That led to 2 years while they stopped the space program, a very intense investigation trying to figure out, analyzing not only engineering flaws but also procedural flaws, reviewing the entire program to see what had gone wrong and how to prevent it again. Since then, since 1986, that would be 17 years ago, the shuttle program has gone with only minor problems. There have been no disasters since that time, and we've all grown quite accustomed to it, a routine part of life in these United States. But now we can be sure that we will be in for another long period of investigation. There is an additional problem this time in that there is the International Space Station, which is supplied by the shuttle, going back and forth fairly frequently, bringing supplies and crew. If the shuttle program, for some reason, has to be suspended, there will be a problem about how to keep the International Space Station supplied. There is a rescue craft attached to the International Space Station so that crew on board have a way to get back to Earth. But one possibility already raised for us by Jim Slade, who is a consultant on the space program, is that there may be the need possibly to shut down the space station for a while. That's way too early to speculate about what exactly may happen. But there is clearly a period, apparently, of some great sadness and mourning facing us here, even at the time when the government is so preoccupied with other concerns overseas. And then the beginning of what's bound to be a very thorough investigation. For those of you just tuning in, the Space Shuttle Columbia has been lost. NASA has declared an emergency. It declared it this morning after losing communications with the Space Shuttle Columbia as it was coming in for a landing. It was due to land in Florida this morning at 9:16 Eastern Time. About 7 minutes after that, when the shuttle had not shown up, NASA asked the reporters there to leave. Video taken at about the time that NASA lost contact with the craft shows several white contrails which appear to indicate the breakup of the shuttle as it came in over Texas. The residents of Texas, many of whom you have heard here this morning, say that they saw the flames and heard a loud bang. This is what it looked like just after 9 o'clock this morning. Officials immediately warned residents in the Dallas-Fort Worth area to beware of falling debris, possible toxic debris. They're still sending out those warnings. And they are also, as far as we know, still scrambling rescue units around on the chance that there may have been one or more of the astronauts who somehow managed to get out of the Space Shuttle Columbia as it was coming in. This is the site visible to the naked eye from many lawns in Texas this morning. People rushed out after they heard the bang. One man told us he thought at first he was watching the shuttle come in with a couple of chase jets next to it, and realized later, of course, that it was not possible. It was way too high, and what he thought were chase jets were parts of the shuttle as it came in over Texas this morning. Israel had its first astronaut on board, and the ambassador of Israel, we learned from George Stephanopoulos, has now been told that the Columbia broke up. We now have an eyewitness on tape.
There was this big boom, and my whole home just shook. It scared me. I really and truly thought we were being attacked or something, you know, with all this war talk and stuff. And my neighbors come running out next door. It scared them to death, too. And all we could see was a white streak, and that's all we saw.
John Yang standing by in Israel as well. He's been listening this morning to reactions there, a moment of great joy, and as he told us a little bit earlier, has been suddenly turned into one of great sadness as one of their war heroes, apparently lost along with the 6 Americans. John, what can you tell us about the reaction in Israel now that the sun is set, the Sabbath has ended?
The sun has set, the Sabbath has ended. The government has put out a statement briefly saying that they stand praying for the astronauts' safe return. That's the last we heard from the government about an hour ago. We had not yet had the briefing that George mentioned. I don't know if that was before Sean O'Keefe, the head of NASA, spoke to the Israeli ambassador in the United States. This was a moment, a brief respite from the tension and other problems that they've had here in Israel. Of course, there was a contentious election earlier in the week, and this was one bright spot. It was something that was covered live on television, the liftoff, live on television on January 16th, and Israeli television was once again broadcasting live the expected and planned return of the shuttle mission. It was live on television here in Israel, the same horrific scenes that you've been seeing back in the States, of the contrails, the debris falling over the skies of Texas. Colonel Ilan Ramon is one of the elite, one of the fighter jet pilots in Israel, a highly decorated pilot, honored for his work in the 1973 Yom Kippur War, one of the pilots who led the successful raid against the Iraqi nuclear reactor in 1981. He was conducting a number of experiments for the Israeli Science Agency about the desert, the weather effects and the wind effects in the desert, training cameras down on the Negev desert here in Israel. And these experiments were being analyzed and examined by both Israeli and Palestinian students. So once again, a moment of sort of bringing people together here in this very troubled region that now appears to have ended in tragedy.
John Yang in Israel, thank you very much. A sad evening ahead there. Martha Raddatz standing by at the Pentagon this Saturday morning as Washington wakes up and begins to respond to this terrible news. Martha, what have you learned at this point?
Fairly senior level and tell them what they know. Also, one other thing we should point out, as you know, Secretary of State Colin Powell is to go before the United Nations on Wednesday and make a case for war against Iraq. Whether this will happen, we can speculate that the administration may look at that as bad timing and inappropriate time to do that, and certainly that is something the administration has to talk about, whether to put that speech off by Secretary of State Colin Powell.
Indeed, the next 3 days were ones in which we'd all been preparing for very intense news and development at the United Nations. How do you think the United Nations is likely to respond to all of this? Will there be a general understanding that postponement may well be necessary here?
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, the UN was in no hurry to hear this speech, I can tell you that. So a postponement wouldn't bother the United Nations at all. And if there is a great time of mourning in the nation and Israel as well, the administration may feel it is appropriate to put that speech off.
Thank you, Martha Raddatz at the Pentagon. Terry Moran, we're beginning to realize what may happen here. Terry Moran at the White House. What do you imagine may be the complications for the schedule we had facing us here? Sorry, Terry is at a briefing right now with George Stephanopoulos. Do we have Jim Slade standing by? Oh, George. George Stephanopoulos is standing by. George, now, how do you think the timing of what we had expected over the next 3 or 4 days may be shifted here, and how do you think Washington may ask it to be shifted?
Well, I was listening very closely to what Martha was saying, and I think she's right that all of these questions will be raised over the next few days. But I think that the administration would be hard-pressed to put off that speech by Secretary of State Powell this Wednesday at the United Nations, because as she said, they are on a very definite timetable. The president said yesterday at his press conference with Prime Minister Tony Blair that he wants this to go on only for weeks, not months. Forces are deploying now in the region, and I think that the president obviously will come out today and show his sympathy. The country will go through its period of mourning, but he will also say that we must continue to confront the national security challenges we face. It is true, however, that this city was consumed. In fact, the world was beginning to be consumed by the increasing prospect of war with Iraq in coming days. In fact, just this morning, I was on a plane on our way to Britain to interview Prime Minister Tony Blair, who had become President's deputy in many ways, to try and rally the world around a second UN resolution that the President said yesterday he would welcome, but didn't appear too eager to have early on, because he feels that it might put off any possible military action against Iraq. So all of those work activity will continue in the coming days, even as we all mourn.
Indeed, George, but of course, thinking back on 1986, 87, and 88, but especially the days following the Challenger disaster, the nation was completely consumed as much of the world
system coming in and then moving into multiple projectiles pretty much coming at us. And again, these are NASA, that video right there is what I saw, again, coming at us. We see it about 100 miles away when it's crossing the Texas-Louisiana border. And again, I saw that particular shot. I saw the multiple projectiles spreading out in a manner that was quite random. And then what I went ahead and sent one of your directors was the National Weather Service radar site that we just showed, and the Doppler radar is actually picking up on that smoke plume that you see right there. That's the smoke plume, and that's the direction that more than likely the debris would be falling in across southeast Texas, perhaps into western Louisiana. And as you mentioned earlier, Dan, a very thick area, very woodsy area, a lot of evergreens in that area, so maybe sometime before debris is completely discovered.
Rob, as we await your video, this is Russ Mitchell, by the way, Rob, as we await your video, what can we expect to see on that? What did you see through the lens?
Well, I it's unfortunately, I'm an amateur videographer, so it wasn't the best video in the world, but nonetheless, it did indicate a singular plume and then multiple plumes and, of course, fireballs heading in different directions. And, in fact, I did see a little bit of a turn to the northeast on the plume. And I did hear one viewer talk about that as well. A viewer from northeast Texas also described that. So some of it seemed to take a sharp left turn off or turn to the north and east right at the end of when we saw this thing breaking up. A little bit past this point, this is where I picked up watching it, and then as we got in a little bit closer, this is what I saw, and that turn, again, a little bit off to the east-northeast. There, again, you see on the National Weather Service radars. In fact, we've confirmed this on not only the Lake Charles radar, but also Shreveport, Fort Polk, and Dallas, the same plume, and in all likelihood, that is the plume of the debris plume and the vapor plume left from the shuttle.
Rob, Dan Rather, from this satellite picture superimposed over a map, all you can do is use your knowledge and give a knowledgeable opinion. From this, it would appear most of the debris is going to be over, you say, the Toledo Bend area of southeast Texas?
Yeah, I would say draw a straight line right along that. We are picking up on those Doppler radars winds at about 20 or 25,000 feet. So that's pretty much the line that the shuttle was coming in. And since from what I'm hearing with respect to some of the debris discoveries right now, I would estimate that the bulk of the debris would be in eastern Texas and perhaps streaming into western Louisiana across, say, Vernon Parish. Kind of tough to tell when you get projectiles that are moving at 5,000 or 8,000 miles an hour how quickly and where they're going to land. But nonetheless, we confirm from what we see on the video that we see on also the Weather Service radars that, again, your plume and your debris plume maybe across that part of eastern Texas into western Louisiana.
Rob Brillo, thank you very much. We're going to put up the picture again of the shuttle crew. These are heroes, and whether any of them are found alive or not would now seems, on the basis of the facts we know, highly unlikely. Highly unlikely. But while NASA officially acknowledges that the shuttle whom these proud and heroic people were aboard is down, its debris scattered over southeast Texas and perhaps part of Louisiana along the Texas line, that NASA has not said anything about the fate of the crew. But the indication, as we've mentioned several times before, that they lowered the American flag to half-staff near the launch site would indicate what NASA believes to be the situation. Now, the NASA news conference scheduled for roughly 11:30 a.m. Eastern Time obviously has not started at that time. We see no sign that NASA is ready yet. NASA just simply sent word earlier that they were hoping to have a news conference in or around the 11:30 Eastern Time, 10:30 Central Time period. So we await that, and at that time expect to have more information. But Russ, let's you and I go down quickly now as we turn this half-hour mark of what we know, what we don't know. The shuttle got into trouble over North Texas just after 9 a.m. Eastern Time, just after 8 a.m. Central Time this morning. Eyewitnesses described seeing what they thought was the shuttle in trouble. Chris Linville said, from the viewpoint we had, they were looking out in the backyard, we did see some flames. We thought maybe it was from the engines or something we didn't know. We knew it was flying over, and we were actually looking for the shuttle passing by. We had no idea. There are a lot of eyewitness comments to that extent. Now, NASA didn't say anything for a long while other than it gave an indication it thought something had happened and that the flight was overdue for its landing. It was, after all, on a long, if you will, glide pattern, if one can call it that, to the Florida landing spot. Then came word that NASA believed the shuttle was down. Then came word NASA said the shuttle was down. Fate of the crew still unknown and unspoken officially by NASA. NASA then put out word that at least one piece of debris, what they believe is debris, was found at an undisclosed site in North Texas. What else?
As you pointed out, the shuttle was scheduled to land at 9:16 Eastern Time. Around 9 o'clock Eastern Time, NASA discovered that they had lost contact with the shuttle. At that point, we had the initial report from NASA from Mission Control saying we've lost contact, but the hope was this was a temporary thing, contact would be restored. But of course, that never happened. Bill Harwood, if I can bring you in just for a moment, we spoke of this earlier. Routinely, during that last approach by a space shuttle, what's going on at Mission Control?
They're all monitoring their data. You know, it's a computer-controlled descent on the space shuttle. It has 4 flight computers that are really doing all of the flying. The commander and the pilot are really along for the ride until the shuttle gets down to an altitude of about 50,000 feet when it's directly over the runway, basically. So at that altitude, everybody's sitting back watching the data, making sure that everything's working properly, and, of course, occasionally checking in with the crew to chat with them and just make sure everything's going okay. So very calm. You know, the Mission Control Center is calm. The astronauts were probably enjoying the ride. They all say on reentry it's a pretty spectacular ride. You get that bright plasma sheath, they call it, very superheated, brightly lighted incandescent air around the crew cabin of the space shuttle. It puts on quite a show. I'm sure they were all monitoring their instruments but enjoying that until whatever happened. And, of course, we still don't yet know what happened. But, Russ, I've been listening to you talk. I want to add one thing. The telemetry stream from the shuttle, the data that gets radioed back to Mission Control automatically by the flight computers, I would be very surprised at this point if they don't have some idea what happened. When they're comfortable enough to share that with us, of course, we don't know. But there is simply so much data coming down. I don't believe that whatever happened could have simply happened with no warning. I believe there's probably information buried in that data, and by now they may well have some inkling of what happened.
Bill Harwood, Dan Rather, stick in here with us, but we have an urgent just moved on the wires from the Associated Press. Dateline, Nacogdoches, Texas, an old Indian trading post, one of the oldest settled areas anywhere in Texas, deep behind what's sometimes called the Pine Tree Curtain down there. Dateline, Nacogdoches, residents say debris, including bits of machinery and bits of metal, have been found strewn across the city. That's Nacogdoches early this morning, hours after NASA lost contact with Space Shuttle Columbia. James Milford, the owner of the local barber shop in downtown Nacogdoches, right around the square there, says it's all over Nacogdoches, the debris. There are several little pieces, some parts of machinery. There's been a lot of pieces about 3 feet wide. unquote. That's in Nacogdoches. NASA declared an emergency after losing communication with Colombia as the ship soared across Texas at an altitude of about 200,000 feet while traveling, and keep this in mind, traveling at 6 times the speed of sound. At that speed, at that altitude, any even small thing going wrong in a spacecraft can be disastrous. So what we have here is apparent confirmation that large parts of the debris are spread over an area of deep East Texas in and around Nacogdoches, Corsicana, stretching over toward the Louisiana line. As we still await the news conference from NASA, this photograph you see in the encircled part, the space shuttle as it was coming down, this is a satellite photograph taken for meteorological purposes, but it shows you that streak in the left-hand corner of the screen of the shuttle coming down. And Bill Harwood, you've made this point repeatedly during the morning, but again, I'm keeping in mind so many people are joining us in progress, that because the space shuttle has short wings for kind of stability, people tend to think of it in terms of an aircraft, but in fact, if anything goes wrong and it begins to drop, there's no joy in saying this, it really drops like a stone.
It really does, Dan. You know, when they line up on final approach, like everyone is familiar with seeing when they're getting ready to land on the runway, they come in at almost a 20-degree angle. I mean, that's 7 times larger than a commercial airliner because it has to keep its speed up. The wings, these short, stubby wings, don't give it the lift of a full-size aircraft, and so it really does drop like a rock. I've heard it described as flying a brick. I've flown the shuttle in the simulator at the Johnson Space Center before, and it has that sense to it. You really are. It looks like you're flying straight down when you're on the flight deck of that thing. It's impressive. And Dan, I wanted to point out one thing from what you were saying a few moments ago about the debris. You know, traveling at 12,500 miles per hour at an altitude of over 200,000 feet, I'd be very surprised if the footprint, they call it, the area where the debris lands, isn't spread out over a pretty wide area. And, of course, I think one of the big concerns right now, Dan, is recovering or finding the crew module. That crew module on the space shuttle, the area right up here between the nose and the start of the payload bay, was actually designed to withstand 20 Gs, 20 times the force of Earth's gravity. In the case of the Challenger accident, the crew module pretty much stayed intact until it got to the ground. Certainly not suggesting this will help the crew, but if the crew has, in fact, perished, they obviously would like to recover the bodies for the family members and, as well as part of the investigation. And I'm sure that's another thing they're going to really be focusing on today.
Bill, let's talk about that debris. NASA has advised residents of North Texas, if you see any of this debris, don't touch it. What kind of materials are we talking about here?
Really rocket fuel primarily, although there's other materials on board that are dangerous too. But when the shuttle is in orbit, it has quite a few thrusters in the nose area and in the back that use hypergolic fuels, they're called. It's a rocket science word. It just simply means when you put them together, they burn. You don't need a spark plug. It makes for a simple engine design. But those hypergolic fuels are extremely toxic. If you breathe it, if you even get some of it on your skin, it can cause serious problems. So I think NASA's just playing it safe. If any small tanks of this material survive to reach the ground, if the shuttle did, in fact, break up at altitude, they're just telling people to stay away from it, and it is extremely dangerous.
Bill, Dan, if you'll hold on just a second, I do want to get right back to you. But let's go quickly again to the White House and CBS News correspondent Mark Knoller. Mark, has the president arrived back at the White House, and are you getting any flow of information there? Well, unfortunately, we're not even getting audio out of Mark Knoller, so we can't know whether he's getting any flow of information or not. These things happen with live television. Let's go back to Bill Harwood. Bill, there are going to be people say, in fact, some no doubt are saying it already, you know, there's something inherently wrong with the U.S. manned space program because, quote, we keep having these accidents. Number one, it's not true that we keep having these accidents, that the Challenger explosion in 1986 was the last, disaster that we had before today. But there's also the question of, well, the Russians have had a very active space program, manned space program. Do they have these kind of accidents?
Dan, you know, it's interesting. I think people lose sight of what a reliable spacecraft the shuttle is. This was the 113th mission, and they've had one failure. No other major rocket system in the world has a record that good. The Russians, of course, have a good launch record, but remember, their whole space program has been based on going to a space station. They only launch rockets every 6 months or so. NASA's been launching the shuttle 5 or 6 times a year and doing it with remarkable success. It is a high-risk venture. You know, in the journalism world, you know, when something becomes routine or seemingly so, people stop thinking about that level of risk, but it's always been there. You know, at launch, that thing weighs 4.5 million pounds when it's loaded with fuel, and it goes from 0 to 100 miles an hour straight up in 10 seconds. At the end of 8.5 minutes, when it gets to orbit, it's going 8 times faster than the bullet from an assault rifle. That's an amazing thing that we all lose sight of. And then when it returns to Earth, it goes 25 times the speed of sound and then glides to a landing at 200 miles an hour on the runway. That will always be risky, regardless of the rocket system.
Bill, dateline again, Nacogdoches, Texas, which is the central city in southeast Texas, in deep east Texas. The Nacogdoches police spokesman, Greg Sowell, says that there were several reports of falling debris in Nacogdoches. That's about 135 miles northeast of Houston. He did not know exactly how many reports there were of citizens calling in saying they'd seen debris in and around Nacogdoches. Nacogdoches has enacted its emergency operations center and is sending emergency crews to the reported debris. According to the police spokesman in the Texas city, at this point, we're just trying to get it out to the public to not touch or tamper with this debris. We said it before, we're going to say it again to anyone. You must not, absolutely must not touch or tamper with this debris. Number one, there's all kinds of toxicity, which is to say really hurtful stuff on some of this debris. And number two, of course, anytime you touch the debris, you run the risk of making it more difficult for investigators to find out exactly why this disaster happened this morning. I do want to mention that while we said some time ago that NASA was trying to put together a news conference for 11:30 Eastern Time, 10:30 Central, NASA emphasized at the time, don't hold us to that precise time. That press conference by NASA, in which we hope to find out a great deal more about what happened this morning, has been delayed. There's no word yet on a new time. When that news conference happens, you, of course, will see and hear it here at CBS News. Now, we have another person who says they're an eyewitness. Andrea Robinson is in the CBS News Bureau in Dallas. Miss Robinson, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Could you tell us exactly what you saw, when you saw it, and how you saw it?
Well, I knew the space shuttle was going to be going overhead at 8:03 Dallas time, and I was laying in bed, and I heard the house shake, and I was half asleep, so I thought it was my daughter playing gymnastics upstairs. So then she came down, and she said, "Mom, did you hear the house shake and the boom?" And I said, "Yeah, I thought it was you." And she said, "No, it wasn't." I said, "Well, the space shuttle is supposed to be going overhead." She said, "Why didn't you tell me?" So we ran outside. I live on the golf course in Las Colinas, Texas, and we saw the trail coming down, and it was a real wide trail. And at that time, I was thinking, that's really strange that the trail is coming down from the sky instead of going across. But I really didn't know anything about. I had never seen a space shuttle before, so I just kind of left it at that. And then I came in the house, and my friend called, and she said, "Turn on the news." And I said, "Oh, yes, the space shuttle was supposed to be going over, and we just saw the trail." And she said, "No, it just exploded," and we were just devastated.
Professor, I want to ask you, you mentioned that you knew that the space shuttle would be coming right over the house. You know, there's been a theory for a long time that Americans lost interest in the whole space program, even the manned space program. But what you said indicates to me that you and your daughter were very much aware of what was happening in the program and when it was happening.
Yes, they announced it on the local news that if you wanted to see the space shuttle, that you would be able to at 8:03 Dallas time. So I was going to get my whole family up, but you know, it was Saturday morning, and I was just a little bit behind schedule.
We thank you very much for being with us, Ms. Robinson.
You're welcome. Thank you.
We're holding for a potential NASA news conference, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, as soon as they can put together facts, so important in these circumstances. As soon as they can put together some facts, they intend to hold a news conference. The space shuttle is definitely down, pieces of it over southeast Texas. Debris found, what is said to be debris found in Nacogdoches, Texas, deep in East Texas. NASA has acknowledged the shuttle is down. NASA says it has a search mission underway. The fate of the astronauts officially unknown. However, unofficially, NASA has lowered the flag to half-staff next to the launch site in Florida, and that there is a report that a piece of debris sparked a fire in an apartment building in Plano that's just north of Dallas, Texas. We have not absolutely confirmed that apartment fire was caused by debris. It's believed that it was. Let's go to Ed Crawley, who's chairman of the MIT Aeronautics Department. He's at our CBS News station in Boston, Massachusetts. Thank you for being with us, Mr. Crawley.
Good morning, Dan.
What can you tell us about this situation to put it in context, to give it some perspective?
Well, as has been pointed out, Dan, it's early in this series of events, and as you commented some time ago, the things we learn early are often not the final facts. But what we know so far is that this was the 107th flight of the space shuttle. There have been 88 successful flights, including in the last few years a spectacular series of successes that have gone to the space station as part of its assembly sequence. We've seen the video a number of times, and the video tends to indicate, as I watch it, that something broke off the shuttle early. The shuttle then went along for some time, and then there was a more dramatic event which indicates a loss of attitude control of the shuttle. It then seems to break up into a number of pieces and then begin to descend.
I want to point out that Ed Crawley, who's speaking to us from our CBS affiliate WBZ, great news television station in Boston, Massachusetts, is an engineer. He worked at the Johnson Space Center and helped train the Columbia mission astronauts. Mr. Crawley, it's Dr. Crawley, isn't it?
That would be fine.
Dr. Crawley, you've done well in putting this in an overall perspective. Let's review why this mission went. What was it that they sought to accomplish in space?
Well, this mission was one of a string of missions to the space station. There was some resupply. There was some science performed on this mission. This is one in which visiting crew, as the Israeli astronaut in this case, often go and participate in. It's a sortie up to the space station for resupply and provisioning, and as well as the conduct of intermediate science objectives over the course of the stay on orbit, about 2 weeks.
Dr. Crawley, you mentioned earlier, while emphasizing we simply don't know what happened. And I think fair to say we're not likely to know what happened for a very long time, if ever, given the fact, and it now appears to be a fact, that debris is spread over at least parts of southeast Texas, east of Dallas and north of Houston, and possibly on into Louisiana. But you mentioned a couple of things I want you to go back over. You said that they're question areas. No one is saying that we conclude that these caused what happened today, but you said there are a couple of questionable areas. Could you go back over those for review for us, please?
Well, the NASA team will immediately freeze the data at JSC. They have a very well-established procedure for freezing all the information that they have so as to have the best possible chance of recovering the sequence of events that led to this tragedy. Now, unfortunately, because this was at a time when the spacecraft was just at reentry interface, where it was just entering the top layer of the atmosphere, this is a time of maximum heating, and the aerodynamic pressure is building on the spacecraft. And this period is characterized always, even on a normal flight, by a loss of transmission, a loss of signal from the spacecraft. So without having seen the telemetry yet, I suspect that one of the difficulties in reconstructing this will be that this was in a period with either reduced or no radio contact and reduced telemetry. They'll have, of course, ground track information and so forth.
Well, while we await what we believe will be a NASA news conference at some point, it's already been delayed from the hoped-for time of about 20 to 21 minutes ago. We're talking to Dr. Ed Crawley, who's with MIT, the Aeronautics and Aeronautics Chairman at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Dr. Crawley, there were two things in the sequence of events involving this shuttle mission that now raise at least a question mark in one's mind, and I want you to put these in context for us. First of all, a crack was discovered this shuttle, but on another shuttle. And because that, I think we're talking about a very small crack was discovered, all the shuttles were then investigated for cracks, and this mission was given a go-ahead. Is that the kind of thing that investigators will be looking at, or is that too far back?
Well, Dan, one of the things the NASA team will do in the next hours and days is collect all the information they have, the information from pre-flight inspections, from the launch telemetry and videos, and start to identify what they call potential root causes. Any recent crack or damage like this they see will certainly be on that list, as will be the potential for an explosion on board the spacecraft on the orbiter, as will be the potential for a failure of the thermal protection system. And this is the time of flight when the thermal protection system is most important. These three things, any immediate previous defects, and a possibility of an explosion and a loss of the thermal protection system, the insulation literally around the spacecraft, will be at the top of their list to follow as leads.
Now, what about the report? It wasn't just a report that after this shuttle had been launched, there was some concern about a piece of insulation, is my understanding, a small piece of insulation, perhaps unaccounted for after the fuel tank so necessary for the launch itself came off. Do you know anything about that, and is that not the kind of thing, or is it, that they'll also be looking into?
Well, I don't know the specifics of this case, but let me explain what happens, which is the tank, the large tank on which the orbiter is actually attached, has a thermal protection system of its own, mostly to keep it cool before launch. Of course, in the launch sequence, the tank is separated and falls into the Indian Ocean, so it's long gone. But if during the launch, during the maximum aerodynamic forces that occur during launch, a piece of that insulation fell off, as I have also heard reported this morning, and impacted the thermal protection system, the famous tiles that we remember from the early days of the shuttle. If a piece of the insulation fell off and impacted the tiles, that would be a point of suspicion that the NASA investigators would follow up very quickly as to whether that led to a series of events which subsequently could have caused a failure of that thermal protection system. Again, we have no idea at this point whether that's in fact the string of events, but it would certainly be on the list of early considerations they would look into.
Dr. Crawley, again, and I know you agree with this, at the risk of being redundant, we want to underscore nobody knows what caused this accident. How long might we anticipate the investigation to take?
Well, in the next few days, there will be a decision whether NASA will be charged internally to conduct an investigation into these events, or whether more of a presidential blue ribbon panel, as we had in the case of the Challenger accident, will be commissioned. I think that's something that in the next few days you'll hear from the White House, whether they have confidence that NASA will be able to do this and be charged, or whether a larger national inquiry will be done. A lot of the time scale of what happens next depends on that decision. If it's an internal NASA investigation, it will likely go months. The Challenger investigation went years. We have had 3 now accidents in our spacefaring history, American history, of a human loss, and on average, the last 2 have run about 18 to 20 months as the scope of the investigation.
We're talking to Dr. Ed Crawley of Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Mr. Crawley, stay with us for a second, because I want to share with you and our viewers that Bill Harwood, our CBS man on the scene at NASA in Florida, says that Sean O'Keefe, who is the NASA administrator, will hold a press conference now. NASA is hoping at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. That would be 12 noon in the Central Time Zone. Yes, previously NASA said it was hoping to hold a news conference as early as 11:30 Eastern Time. I now repeat for emphasis, and of course our CBS News coverage will continue straight on. The NASA administrator will hold a news conference hopefully at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, and at that time we may learn more, although I don't think anyone should anticipate learning a whole lot more. You just never know, but one wouldn't want to build expectations too high, because NASA is still, the whole National Aeronautics and Space Administration is in a state of shock about this disaster that has happened with the space shuttle. Also, Dateline Cape Canaveral say, well, didn't we already know that? But the fact of the matter is that we have not had a senior U.S. official from Cape Canaveral, he's unidentified, but saying that flatly, saying that the space shuttle is, quote, gone. We've reported to you previously that various people in and around Nacogdoches, Texas now report finding debris, many reports of debris over the city. We have not confirmed that what these people say they see is, in fact, debris, but there's so many reports from Nacogdoches confirmed by the police department, people calling from, quote, all over town in that East Texas city, that it seems highly probable that what these people are seeing is, in fact, debris. We'll go back to Dr. Crawley, and I really appreciate your time, Doctor. There are now only 3 space shuttle vehicles left. Is it likely any new ones will be built? And if any new ones are not built, is the whole program in some kind of mortal danger?
Well, that's a very interesting question, Dan, and it's obviously a little early to weigh in on that. The last space shuttle, the one that replaced the Challenger, was commissioned in about 1987 or 8 and finished in the late 80s or maybe 1990. And it was built using some spare parts that had remained from the original construction. They had essentially laid in some spares. It's now been about 13 or 14 years since that time, and I think it would be unlikely that NASA would try to commission the construction of another orbiter at this time. Still too early to say. NASA has just completed a reprogramming of its efforts to replace the shuttle, which involved building sort of an intermediate space plane, mostly to transport crew to orbit and back to go to the space station, and delaying the development until the next decade of a fully reusable replacement for the shuttle. I suspect what's more likely to happen is this series of events will cause Sean O'Keefe, the NASA administrator, and his team to re-examine those recent decisions and see if the timing and pace of that replacement schedule is still appropriate.
Dr. Crawley from MIT, if you'll stick with us, please. Well, we have some news to pass along. Just a moment ago, we reported Dateline Cape Canaveral that a senior U.S. official says that space shuttle is, quote, gone. There has still been no official word from NASA, keeping in mind that NASA now says that it hopes to hold a news conference at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, 12 Central. But this same senior U.S. official says there is no hope for either the shuttle or its crew of 7. Let me repeat that for emphasis. A senior U.S. official says the space shuttle is, quote, gone. He says there's no hope for either the shuttle or its crew of 7. Let's pause for a moment to absorb that, and let's put up the picture of the heroes. Russ Mitchell will read the names of those aboard the shuttle as the word comes from a senior U.S. official that they and the shuttle are gone.
Commander of the flight, Colonel Rick Husband. This was his second mission, as you can see there, 45 years old, Amarillo, Texas. Lieutenant Colonel William McCool was the mission pilot. This was his first mission, 41 years old. His hometown is San Diego, California. And as we're going to see here, these folks come from around the country and around the world. David Brown, Commander David Brown, was the mission specialist, 46 years old, from Arlington, Virginia, right outside of Washington, D.C. His first mission. Commander Lowell Clark, a doctor, Dr. Lowell Clark, commander, first mission, 46 years old, from Racine, Wisconsin. Kalpana Chawla, engineer, aerospace engineer, her first mission, 41 years old. She was born in Karnal, India, but she became a citizen of the United States. Michael Anderson, Lieutenant Colonel Michael Anderson, mission specialist. This was his second mission, 42 years old. He's from out west, Spokane, Washington. Milan Rahman, Colonel Rahman, from Tel Aviv, Israel, his first mission, 48 years old. He was part of this NASA program to involve more countries in the U.S. space program because of him, his nationality being from Israel. Security was beefed up on this flight. However, there is no official word from anyone, as we've been reporting this morning, as to what may have happened here. And the thought of terrorism, while not been completely ruled out by the White House, certainly is being seen as something that is not a possibility, not very much of a possibility. And there we are once again, these 7 astronauts, 6 Americans, and 1 Israeli citizen.
And 2 of those astronauts are American women. Let's go to Bill Harwood in Florida. Bill, if you're there, bring us up to date on what you're hearing, what you've learned.
Yes, Dan, I'm here. No real change yet. The flight controllers, of course, are still looking over the data. As you say, NASA Administrator Sean O'Keefe, new on the job, just appointed recently, is obviously faced with his biggest challenge. I'm not even sure the right word to pick for this. Is going to address the media and the nation, really, at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. But no word yet on what might have caused this or what the impact might be.
Bill Harwood, as you sit there from your vantage point earlier, you told us you looked out the window and the flags were flying at half-staff. What other activity can you see there from where you are?
None at all, Russ. This is a Saturday at the Space Center. The only people that would come in today is the landing team. They were all out at the runway, which is a little distance from here, and of course in what they call the firing room, just over my right shoulder, the launch control center, if you will, is where the people are. Behind me, of course, is the launch pad that Columbia took off on January the 16th when this flight began 16 days ago. And as you say, when they rolled out and lowered that flag to half-staff, that was a terrible sight to see, very reminiscent of what happened on January the 28th, 1986, when they lowered the flag, and that was the first sign at all that we had that NASA thought the crew was lost.
Bill, Commander Rick Husband had just 1 other space flight under his belt. How and why did he become the commander of this mission?
That happens, depends on the merit of the flyer, Dan. A lot of times commanders, their second flight, their commander. And of course, in the early days of the program, when they didn't have a lot of flights and an experienced astronaut base, the commanders were first-time flyers. So that in and of itself was not unusual at all. Before any flight, it's estimated that the commander and the pilot do more than 1,000 approaches to a runway in NASA's shuttle training aircraft, which is a business jet that they've rigged up to handle just like a space shuttle on final approach. It has the same instrumentation. You wear the spacesuit. It's just like landing the real thing. More than 1,000 of those per flight. So I don't think there's any concern at all about his competence or technical ability. And plus, at that phase of the entry, Dan, the computer's flying under the control of its computers, the shuttle, I should say. They don't take over manual control until they get to an altitude of about 50,000 feet, and that doesn't happen until just a few minutes before actual landing. So they were sitting there watching their instruments as this whatever happened and not actively involved in flying the shuttle at that point.
Well, Bill, let me make explicitly clear and underscore that the thrust of the question was not that Commander Husband in any way
I completely understand.
was not prepared. An Air Force colonel from Amarillo, you have to know, we do know, that he was prepared by long hours, grueling hours of preparation. But I seem to recall, I may be wrong about this, that the original commander for this mission got ill or something. Perhaps I'm wrong about that.
No, we had a couple of flights last year where some crew members got replaced. One space station crew member got replaced at the last minute because of illness, and the pilot of a shuttle mission late last year had to be replaced, again, because of an illness issue. But in this case, Rick Husband's been commander assigned to this flight since, I think, 2001, as I recall. He's been in training for this mission all along.
Well, and let's have no doubt that on the word of the NASA official who says not only is the space shuttle gone, but the crew is gone, that Commander Husband and others, all others in the crew, died heroes. Quickly giving you a look at the situation at the moment, NASA has scheduled a news conference for now 1 o'clock Eastern Time, 12 in the Central Time Zone. NASA declared an emergency after losing contact with the crew and sent search teams to the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and now search teams are headed more to the east in East Texas. Ed Roner, who's Nacogdoches, Texas airport manager, has said that some type of tank ended up on his runway. He said he's talking about some sort of tank off an aircraft. Mr. Rohner also says that there are pieces of debris all along the entrance road to the Nacogdoches Airport. National Guardsmen have been called out to protect the debris. A search for debris is underway throughout the area east and north of Dallas, stretching on into at least parts of Louisiana. Gary Hunzinger of Plano, Texas, said that he saw the shuttle flying overhead. He said he saw two bright objects flying off each side of it. He thought that they might be some sort of pursuit aircraft at first, but of course the shuttle was flying at 200,000 feet plus, so there could be no other aircraft up there. Benjamin Laster of Kemp, Texas, says his barn started shaking, and he and his family ran out and started looking around. Laster said he saw a puff of vapor and smoke and a big chunk of material fall. And the situation at this hour is that a senior U.S. government official says the space shuttle is, quote, gone. This same official says there's no hope for either the shuttle or its crew of 7. The next event, in terms of which we hope to have some official information to get perhaps additional facts on this disaster, scheduled for 1 o'clock Eastern Time. And Russ, I'm reminded that Ronald Reagan, President Reagan, in his speech to the nation on the day the shuttle Challenger exploded, killing all 7 of its astronauts, quoted the following: "The crew of the space shuttle Challenger honored us by the manner in which they lived their lives. We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them this morning, as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye and slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God," unquote. President Ronald Reagan with the Space Challenger eulogy back in the mid-1980s.
That was January 28th, 1986.
Bill Harvard, if you're still with us in Florida, this is a picture of the shuttle Challenger exploding. Sometimes on television it's difficult to tell what's today and what's yesterday. This was the shuttle Challenger exploding just after the commander had given the full throttle forward. 73 seconds into the flight, it exploded and crashed to Earth. Quite a different situation today. These are the old Challenger explosion pictures. Today we have only a few photographs from today high in the sky, but this was on descent. The first time that shuttle has had difficulty, certainly anything approaching this kind of difficulty on descent. Now these are pictures from today. Bill, I was going to ask that, keeping in mind that the Challenger shuttle exploded on January 28, 1986, and then this happens in early February, will or will not, one of the things to be looking into is there something especially dangerous we didn't know about with shuttle launches in deep winter, even though they're in Florida?
Well, Dan, I think in this case, I wouldn't think that at all. The temperatures here when the shuttle took off and leading up to launch, you folks up in New York would probably consider